The truth is, actually, when I started at Eunomia, I found that going to dinner parties and saying you worked in waste management meant people would complain about their recycling collection. So I thought I need to change this. If you talk about marine litter, you get a completely different emotional response, which I quite liked. So we moved on from there. Joe talked earlier on about things that are both interesting and important, and I think marine plastics hits both of those pretty hard. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we've done, how we got into this in the first place, how we became pretty much fully immersed in this topic, and why we think it's one of the key challenges for the 21st century. So, in recent years, I think there's been a real, probably even in the last 2 years, the rate of growth of public awareness and concern about marine litter, I think, has rocketed. And at one level, it's not hard to see why. I mean, it's just wrong. You have these otherwise pristine environments into which you have these man-made items that shouldn't be there. The juxtaposition between the two is pretty stark. And I think people get this. And there's still a disconnect between the fact that 80%, give or take, of what ends up, of what is in the sea, comes from these typically fairly mundane items. So it all comes, 80% comes from land. But I think the public really do get it. And once it's in the sea, it goes all over. It truly is a global problem. We first, as Joe mentioned, we first got into this 7 years back. We did a piece of work, I say a piece of work, I think it was one of the, possibly still the longest single report that we've written. Correct me if I'm wrong, someone, but International Review of Waste Management Policy for the Irish government. And at the time, 5 years previously, in 2002, they had implemented a very successful measure that prevented waste and litter, the levy on single-use plastic bags. And looking back, it's remarkable to think that this was, 9 years ahead of the Welsh charge? So they're really leading the way here. And the minister at the time was very keen on litter prevention, and he asked us to look at another measure that had potential to reduce litter. And this is deposit refund systems or deposit return systems on drinks containers. So we looked into this, we looked into the evidence, and they work really rather well. The typical reduction seen for beverage containers that have a deposit placed on them is about 80% higher in some cases. And it also leads to high rates of really good quality recycling. In terms of reducing overall litter, the volume can be reduced by about 30 to 40%, and that's what you might certainly expect to see in Scotland, which is a current example. So, following this, we were fortunate to undertake a piece of work for CPRE to look into this in more detail. And this work had a substantial pro bono component to it, because we really felt this was an interesting instrument with potential for application across many countries, and we felt it's worth the investment to look into this in more detail, to really get into the nuts and bolts of how these things work and all the operational costs and the like. And it was a very high profile study. I think credit to CPRE for the contacts they had and also the quality of the work. I was involved with it, so credit to others for this one. And there was a question asked in Parliament. David Cameron was asked about this idea. He said it was very interesting. I'm not sure whether he meant the idea or the report. I'm not sure if he's read it himself. But what we have here, one of the key things we're looking at was all the different costs and the benefits. And this is just the annual costs and the benefits. So one of the most important ones here is disamenity, which is an awful term, beloved by economists, but what this represents is how upset the public are by litter. Effectively, it's looking at how much would they value a certain proportion of reduction in litter. So, not much evidence was available. There was a study from Australia, and we looked at the marginal reduction in litter that would be expected, and we brought this across. Worked out about £48 per household. That was the benefit on those terms, just really the visual disamenity. And that's really important, because if you include this, the net benefits per annum are about 820 million. If you exclude it, it's a net cost to society. So this is taking the wider societal perspective. So one of the key recommendations to government from this report was we really need a better understanding of disamenity of litter. What are these impacts? And they did. I'm not not sure whether it was entirely due to that, but the government did commission some work as a study from DEFRA in 2011. And we were able to then incorporate this into a really interesting piece of work with Zero Waste Scotland, where we were asked to look at the indirect costs of litter. So the direct costs are just picking up litter, so that's a cost faced by local authorities and other duty bodies. The indirect cost is everything else. So wider impacts, including things like, it was a great piece of work. They said, go and explore these costs. You know, we don't want accurate figures, we want a range, we want a rough idea to set things going. So crime, for example, we looked at the evidence, the links between litter and crime, so litter as a causal factor in crime, based on the broken windows theory, in that a littered environment is indicative of social disorder, and people think that they won't be under surveillance in the same way, and people, particularly opportunistic theft, people pick things up that aren't theirs to pick up. We looked at the costs associated with crime and evidence from the states where they're cleaned up a local area, and look at the reduction in crime associated with that. So we thought up to 22 million per year for Scotland. The mental health costs, I think what this is, it's a perceived lack of control over your local area. If other people are littering where you live, it's a violation of the area, and it's something that people can't control. So links between low-level, poor mental health, anxiety, depression, we tease those out, put a value on that. Property values, if just 1% of Scottish properties were devalued by the 2.7% that was demonstrated in an American study, the reduction in value to those householders would be £100 million per year. So there were many, many other wider impacts, but these can all be subsumed into this value at the bottom, which is from the DEFRA study that we applied, looking at how much people will be willing to pay for a cleaner environment. And what was important about the work we did that preceded considerations at the end was it contextualises this figure. People would say, oh, that figure, it's ridiculous, it's nonsense. But when you look at the impacts on mental health, what it might mean for your property values, other things in terms of crime in your local area, the figures started to add up here. And what we found was that back on this slide, this was based on £48 per household per year. The evidence suggested the value is actually about double that, associated with a reduction from a deposit return system. So it gave real backing to that figure. And this was just land-based litter. This is just local neighbourhoods. So this is not looking at marine litter at all. So the argument from this is you can justify a lot of these interventions disregarding the marine environment. A lot of the stuff comes from land and particular measures you can put in place. And what happens in terms of impacts on the marine environment are a bonus. And so up until then, we'd done nothing really on the marine environment, and then we hit it in a big way in 2011. We managed to win a piece of work for the United Nations Environment Programme for their Convention on Migratory Species, which was great. It was actually funded by the Australian government, and they asked us to look into the impacts of migratory species, and it resulted in 3 separate reports. It was, by turns, fascinating and harrowing just to look at the number of ways that we are really messing things up. But what was really nice was that, as well as describing the impacts, they gave us an opportunity, they encouraged us to say, well, how can we prevent this? How can we address these challenges? And we ended up actually editing the draft UN resolution on this, which was an experience I've not had before, which was rather fun. So just to go through some of the main impacts, entanglement, predominantly with abandoned or lost fishing gear, is a key one. Some of the most immediate effects of this can be animals drowning, but also infection of the lacerations. Some of this can be quite unpleasant. Where the ropes pull tight, you get infections there. Baleen whales often get nets entangled around their mouths, and what this means, they can't actually close their mouths properly to dive. So they have to swim their mouths open the whole time. And manatees, turtles can lose flippers as a result of this. Useful fact, potentially a turtle can operate on 3 flippers. If it only has 2, it can't. And then migratory species move huge distances, and energy expenditure is absolutely critical. And if a large whale only has a very small bit of rope or fishing net, that can, over a long distance, can be a huge drag. leading to exhaustion and falling behind from the other animals it should be travelling with, meaning they're more likely to be predated. Birds as well. There's a local example of gannets just off the Welsh coast at Grassholm Island. This is kind of natural behaviour for gannets. When they nest, they pick up floating seaweed to provide the basis for their nesting material. And sometimes they additionally get bits of fishing debris. Sometimes they just pick that up, mistaking it for it. Now, Grassholm is absolutely covered in this, and the RSPB and Marine Conservation Society go out from time to time to deal with animals that have severed feet and the like. And the immediate feeling with this is, can we not go and clear it all away? And for a private client, we did a piece of work looking at options to clean up the oceans, removing what's there a short while back. And they were very keen on this kind of thing. And I phoned the warden. He said, if you remove what is the structure of the island, the social structure of the colony will be totally disrupted and they won't come back. They won't settle there. So it's really quite complicated. This is something that turtles and plastic bags, it's almost a cliche, but I'm not sure many people realise that obviously turtles are designed to eat jellyfish. How do you get hold of a jellyfish? Pretty difficult. So turtles have hairs pointing downwards inside their throat. So they can't actually vomit, they can't reject things when they realise that they're not good for them. So once they start, they have to keep taking it in. Immediate physical damage is one thing, but also bizarrely, having plastic in the gut causes too much gas to be generated, affecting the buoyancy. They float more than they want to. And a recent example, it's not the only cause, but the sperm whales washed up on the North Sea, a lot of plastic was found inside them. So along with underwater noise and just lack of prey, overfishing, leading to reduced number of things for marine fauna to eat, it's another contributory factor. Because having a full gut can make animals feel that they are full, so they don't get the energy that they need. On a more positive note, we were able to report back to the Australian government, the ultimate client, that some other work they had funded, the CSIRO is the Commonwealth Research Institute, they had done what looks like a lovely jolly. They had done on various trips to Fiji, North Island, New Zealand. So trips on the boat to survey for marine litter. They'd also gone all the way around the coast doing beach surveys. They'd missed out the Gulf of Carpentaria, I'd imagine saltwater crocodiles perhaps, put them off there. But what they found is that drinks containers were pretty ubiquitous in all states apart from South Australia, and they put that down to the deposit system. So this small financial incentive to do the right thing. Now in the last year we've done a pretty significant piece of work for DG Environment looking at a number of different issues. And the port reception facilities was a really good example of where that same financial incentive can be used to encourage. Port reception facilities is where people drop off waste from boats at ports. There's a number of different ways they cover the costs on this. And for a long time, it was felt that just having no extra charge for waste delivery would be enough to incentivise the return of waste. And we demonstrated to them that actually, no, there's a hassle factor. You need a penalty, you need them to pay a deposit, which is then refunded when they deliver waste correctly. A financial incentive can be used. In the same study, we looked at fishing and aquaculture litter, and again, a sort of deposit refund system in the context of producer responsibility for fishing nets and other fishing gear can work well. Economic instruments are great up to a point. Some things you just need to ban, and this was the most contentious single issue that we're asked to look at for the Commission. Cosmetic microplastics, the industry had come up with some fairly impressive sounding commitments to phase these out. We looked in a little bit more detail and they'd committed to phase out those above a certain size and below a certain size in rinse-off products. And those who are not familiar with the cosmetics industry, rinse-off products is shower gel, and soaps and similar things. Sunscreen, which contains microplastics, is not a rinse-off product. But one of the things the Commission asked us to do was to put this in context of other sources of microplastics. So these are microplastics, everything that's under 5 millimetres. Cosmetics on a European level are down here, really quite small. Marine paint even smaller. This was discovered when vessels were towing nets behind them to try and see how many microplastics they were. They found phenomenally high amounts of microplastics behind the survey ships until they realised it was actually microplastics from their paint that were being washed off and collected. So they changed their approach after that. Textiles, recent research has shown that when you wash polyester items, thousands of microfibres get washed out and enter the sea. They can't be stopped at sewage treatment works. Pellet spills, even larger source. We did some work recently trying to calculate this at the UK level. And tyre dust, so vehicle tyre dust. If some of the stuff, the emissions are not just from the exhaust pipe, some of the stuff that we don't end up breathing, the coarse particles rather than fine cut particles, will be washed out and can end up in the sea. So one of the really frightening things about this plastic is not just the more immediate impacts it's causing on marine life, it's some of the more less obvious ones. Plastics themselves can contain harmful chemicals or the additives on them can cause problems, and these can accumulate in marine life. When it's in the sea, plastic debris can also adsorb, so attract to its surface persistent organic pollutants that are there. So the concentration is much higher than the background level, and again, these things get eaten. This was a bit of lab-based research by Plymouth University, or Plymouth Marine Lab from 2013 to demonstrate that zooplankton absorb microplastics. So they got fluorescent microplastics, and this is in a controlled situation, and these things that are the basis of the food chain absorbed microplastics. Now the effect they observed was that those that had absorbed microplastics ate much less algae. So the things that eat this are getting a much less nutritious meal. So pretty much the whole marine food chain is based on these little things, and plastics are potentially causing problems. Confirmation came at the end of last year in the North Pacific that this is actually happening in reality. They're also ingested by lugworms, mussels and oysters, which reduces the amount of food they're taking in and causes weight loss in lugworms. For the Severn Estuary, this is really bad news for the migratory birds that rely on these mudflats are very high in calorific values so far. This may reduce. Oysters also produce fewer and less healthy offspring. Now, this is not just bad news for those who like to eat oysters. Oysters play a really important role in the provision of ecosystem services, in taking up nitrogen, taking up phosphorus. And even New York is reseeding oyster beds in part as a way of providing defence against future storm surges. So not good impacts there. And fish eat these things, and we like to eat fish. So the impacts on humans, not fully understood yet, but I'm not expecting them to be good impacts. Some of our research, bringing together various bits of academic papers, where the plastic ends up, and this is really important, 94% ends up on the sea floor. The amount floating at the surface is about 1% of all the plastics in the marine environment. 5 times as much is actually found on the beach. Now, plastics, some of them are neutrally buoyant, some positively, but all of them tend to get biofouled. So stuff lives on them, stuff grows on them, and they get dragged down. Marine life also gets in the way of efforts to remove this. So where people have tried to take smaller particles of plastic out in the mid-Pacific, they get, I think it's about, for every kilogram of plastic taken out, they get about 500 grams of marine life. Now there's not much in the way of marine life in the mid-Pacific. It's pretty nutrient poor. So we need to leave it in there, really. So of the accessible plastic, because sea floor can't really get to reasonably, the beach litter seems to be, there's much more of it around. And importantly, if you look at the amount, the concentration, the seafloor on a global average about 70 kilograms per square kilometre. At the surface, the peak amount in the North Pacific Gyre is 18 kilograms per square kilometre. But the average across the globe is less than 1 kilogram per square kilometre. Yet this is where we've got a lot of money being invested in trying to pick things up. On beaches, the concentration is around 2 tonnes per square kilometre. So if you're going to do something about the marine plastics, obviously prevention is the first thing, but once it's there, and there's a flux between the beach and the sea. Stuff moves on, stuff moves off. And if you collect from a beach every day over a month, you get an awful lot more plastic than if you collect it just once in a month. So the take-home message is, if we're going to do something about stuff that's already in the marine environment, clean the beach. And to help make the point, we've commissioned an infographic. It's made me more hot off the press than the residual waste infrastructure review. We had the last version just a few moments ago, making the point that about 80% of plastics in the sea come from land. Fishing litter and shipping litter account for the rest. Microplastics are just under about 1 million tonnes a year, so this is based on our European Commission research, grossed up to a worldwide scale. But I think even more importantly is this issue of where it ends up and what this means for efforts to take it out. And that's it. Thank you very much.